everybody. Look at this gorgeous crowd. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I had the same reaction. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I guess we will dive right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
And I'll start with one of those. I always, when I'm talking with people, sort of start with some very basic questions. Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the beginning. No.
Let's do it.
I'm wondering if you could talk with the audience or tell them a little bit about the work that you do.
Yes.
And how you came to do that work.
All right. So I'm going to give this my best shot. Those who know me well know that, often, I bet this is true for many of you, I'll be in conversations with folks, right? And they'll say, what's your story? And I'm sort of like, I don't know. I'm just here with you right now today. So I'm going to do my best to say what I think might be relevant and interesting for this community. So I have the blessing and good fortune of being the daughter of an educator, my mother, a master teacher, and a master drummer, my father. So my father, right, when he was about maybe 12 years old, Jamaican American in North Philly, decided that he wanted to better understand the ways in which the African diaspora connected culturally and musically. Now, you talk about an liberated imagination, because there certainly was nothing in his environment that said, go study the African diaspora, right? Mm-hmm. Nothing encouraged that. But he recognized, and Janell, you and I are going to talk about this, he recognized the genius and expertise that existed in the culture and traditions of Black African heritage people. And so he, when he was about 21, he got the marking on his arm of being a master drummer according to ancient tradition in Ghana. So that's my father. So I grew up, with that, right? And I grew up with my mother, who understood similarly that there was just genius and resource abundantly so. But the other thing that I think is relevant to my story is that my mother and father told me from the time I was a little girl, there's two things they did. My mother had a sign in the kitchen that said in big, bold black letters, THINK. And so when I would come to my mother, coming, with some complaints or challenge, something I wanted her to fix for me, she would just do this and point to the sign and tell me, think. So there's something about being pushed to think, understanding the genius and abundance of the African diaspora. And the last thing I'll say that connects is that my parents told me that, Tulaine, listen, people, some who look like you, many who do not, will lie to you about who you are, your worth, and where you come from. And so because my parents taught me that, what it freed me to do, and we're going to get to this in our discussion, is it freed me to not waste time being surprised about what is true about the systems in which we live. You understand? And we're going to talk about why we can't really, in my opinion, waste a lot of our time or energy being surprised and bemoaning and wringing our hands. We can rage when we need to rage and grieve when we need to grieve. Yes. But we can't live there, because depleted, enraged, exhausted humans cannot build a new world, right? So, I could do the resume thing, but I don't think it's that interesting. It's like, I've been an entrepreneur, I'm a musician, I'm a playwright, and I do think that all combined to help me see different aspects of what it takes to make something happen. We'll talk about what that means in specifics over the course of our discussion. Yeah.
Well, you've reminded me of something from my own childhood.
Yeah.
You were talking about just a fixture of your childhood.
Yes.
You would have a problem you wanted your mother to solve.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I don't know why, but I was always asking my parents what some word or another meant. And so my parents kept a gigantic dictionary on our fireplace sort of hearth. And frequently, my father would say to me, Janell, we can talk about it, but first go look it up.
See?
Right?
That's right.
And
That's
so
right. Yeah.
I would usually, at least 2 or 3 times a day, have to spend some time with the dictionary, right?
Yes.
So I feel, perhaps that is why I feel like this is a good place to start, right? All that time I spent with the dictionary.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm very, in the course of our conversation, something that you have said that really struck me, that there is a marked and important difference between charity, charitable giving,
Yes.
and social impact investing.
Yes.
And I wonder if we shouldn't start there. I wonder if you could help people to understand the difference and why that difference matters in this particular moment.
Absolutely. It's a really important question because so much of the work and even access that gets opened up for people who have in some way been identified as other or margin. We're going to talk in a minute about how, the truth is the majority is actually looking very different in this country very soon. We'll get there. But, if you've been in some way identified as other or margin because of racial identity, gender, where you were raised, what kind of economic story or history you have, there's this way that even if you're talking about traditional investing, it can be treated as if it's a charitable endeavor to invest in you, right? The story of increased risk when investing in the initiatives, businesses, or ideas of people of color, right? And part of what I believe and know to be true, one thing about me is I'm a student of history and a futurist, which means it gets really interesting in this brain sometimes. But what it means is I look to what has history shown us and how can that empower our future. Charity, the history of charity, is that it has its origins in the sort of manifest destiny ethos, right? The same ethos that informed colonialism globally, the same ethos that informed the chattel slavery in this part of the world, which was a particularly brutal, systemic, and violent approach to slavery, right? That idea that there are some people who are ordained by God to help those who are less fortunate, which by definition implies a sort of hierarchy of capability, right? It means that the solutions could not possibly reside in the people who are in some way receiving the charity. Now, I don't want to vilify charity because, particularly from a spiritual perspective, there can be things that are beautiful about it, right? Tithing, there are things that can be beautiful about it. But when we confuse charity and social impact investing and philanthropy, we actually do ourselves an incredible disservice. The other risk of confusing charity with social impact investing and philanthropy is that charity, there was a research done on the brain, right? And so people kind of mapped people's brains when they heard the word charity. And charity actually lights up the pleasure centers in our brain, meaning that when people engage in charity, the expectation is that it will feel good, right? And that's why if you think about if you do grant making with some folks or you try to seek investment dollars from some folks, you can feel like you're dancing far beyond simply speaking about the outputs and productivity of your model. It's because if people are looking at you because you are a person of color, a woman from a rural environment, indigenous, whatever the identity marker that is used to make you other, that there can be this sort of expectation that you make them feel good. Do you understand what I'm saying? Are you with me? Okay, I'm looking at you. I don't know if you're with me. I want to make sure you're with me. Okay, so it's important, but when you talk about impact and investing, literally different parts of our brain light up. If I am investing in your business, in your nonprofit, in your service, then we're in it together. Then we are peers who both have something of equal value to offer to the creation of the solution, to the scaling of the business. It's a very different stance, and it requires that you show up differently as the entrepreneur or grantee, and it requires that you show up differently and ask different questions and use different metrics to assess impact if you're the investor or philanthropist. It's a very different model. Again, charity perhaps has its place in a spiritual context, in my opinion, but when I'm talking about impact and systems change, I have no interest in charity.
So, an interesting point, yeah. So I think that also, and you alluded to this as well, and I think now is the moment. I doubt this is going to come as a complete shock to anybody in this room, and maybe it'll be a welcome bit of news for those that it is not, that it is unknown to. Yeah. But I think we sit here at a particularly interesting moment, right? And there are all kinds of things obviously happening in America at the moment, but one of them that gets, I think, alluded to often, but is not overtly stated, is the reality that our country and who lives in it, its fundamental makeup, its demographics, are on the verge very soon of a tremendous change.
That's right.
So much so that I actually called the Census Bureau this morning to check in. to make sure I had this
When
right.
you have a senior correspondent on the case, we don't play with the data. I love it.
And these are their latest projections, but as of 2045, the United States is going to be a white minority country. And that change is so substantial that the Census Bureau has decided to move away from using terms like minority. I had a similar reaction, yeah. I thought that was an interesting little tidbit.
Isn't that
I
interesting?
also thought it was interesting that that date is actually a little further out. As recently as 2 years ago, the Census Bureau was projecting that this would be a white minority nation by 2044. But because of who died in the course of the COVID pandemic, which populations are growing and which are not, that has been pushed out a bit to 2044. But make no mistake, that's 22 years from where we are right now. That's the time that it takes for a child that is born this year to become an adult, right? Time flies. So in 22 short years, that is often talked about, when it is talked about, as if it is some kind of coming crisis for America. And I think for many of us in this room, it is likely not a crisis, but I think understood as an opportunity.
Absolutely.
And there are many changes that are going to be necessary.
Absolutely.
But also maybe different ideas and possibilities that need to be brought to the fore.
Yeah.
And I guess I wondered, Tulaine, if you could talk just a little bit about, first, of course, if you have anything you want to say about that major moment, 2044 is upon us, 2045, is upon us. But I think in particular what that means, right? Are we ready? What does it mean? What does it require?
Yeah. It's so significant, isn't it? Like language has power, and it is not a light thing, a small thing, that we're going to change the nomenclature of minority, depending on for whom that would be true. And so a couple of things I want to offer. So there's an article called The Water of Systems Change, written by John Kenya and Peter Senge. The reason I bring it up is they talk about, in the most kind of accessible way I've seen, the core elements of what holds a system in place. And what happens for many of us who aspire to systems change is that we do ourselves a bit of a disservice because we focus exclusively on the parts of a system that we can easily see and touch. So we focus on policy, we focus on practices, we focus on capital flow. All of these things matter. But if you're trying to change policy, practice, and capital flow, and you completely ignore mental models, relationships, networks, and power dynamics, all you're doing is creating an escape hatch for a small number of a lucky few. And I think many of us in this space experience what that feels like. It pits us against each other. If even the people in this tent were collaborating, the game would be different. Right? Yeah. So it's time for us to own and sit in the power and agency that comes from what is simply true. So mental models, why am I talking about them? Systems change requires that you address the mental models, the beliefs that inform the system, that you address the networks. Which people actually get to build relationships? How many people are segregated from each other? Think about how many people in your life look and live like you and how many do not, right? And then power dynamics. You have to do real assessments and mapping of power. What this change means, Janell, is that those of us who know how to build effective and sustainable coalitions are going to have the adaptive capability to thrive. Because what you said that's important is we're not replacing one majority with another majority.
No.
We're not. What's happening is we will be a majority people of color nation, and there will be a coalition of multiple ethnicities and identities and cultures. And so the only businesses and education centers, right, and communities and cultural leaders who are going to be able to thrive in that context that you described are the ones who have the ability to build and sustain coalitions across identity and lived experience. It's more important now than it's ever been. And we can't afford to pretend it's an optional thing. nor can we afford to, in my opinion, pretend that coalition building, what some would call diversity work, is a nice to have. We have the benefit of living in a moment where the right thing to do is also the smart thing to do, right? And I think that's really important. Like I'm noticing, and I love to see all of y'all beautiful faces, and the melanin is gorgeous, right? And I'm wondering, why aren't there more people who look different in terms of their identity? We cannot continue to treat these conversations as if they're only relevant for people of color, right? We are talking about the makeup of the nation.
We are.
Right? So anyway, that was a lot, but that's what comes up for me when I hear the numbers that you shared. Yeah.
When I heard that figure, as you said, for me, I think there are several things inside of that reality. And as you said, this is reality.
It's right.
When there are many things inside that reality that stand out to me. One of the biggies is that one of the reasons that the United States population is going to shift is that the white birth rate is declining.
Okay.
So much so that immigration is going to outpace natural birth in 2030. That is around the corner.
Wow.
Right?
That's serious.
Right.
That's
that is a transformed country. So when we make presumptions about the well-being of Americans, the experiences of Americans, what kinds of products, goods, and services people want to buy and sell,
that's right.
What kinds of needs people have,
that's right.
All of those questions are deeply affected. And theoretically, it does mean that there have to be systems changed, but it also means that there has to be some capacity to hear from people that we don't usually hear from, to have some level of a capacity to believe that there are other ideas, other fonts of wisdom. I think in nonprofit spaces, because there is this need for funding, there is often a lot of deference given to those who provide the funds.
Right.
And because of the shape and nature of wealth in the United States today, that means you're often having to prioritize the concerns, interests, priorities, goals, pet projects of wealthy white individuals, right? This evening, just as an example, right, as we were preparing for this conversation, we met a young woman who we were blown away.
Absolutely.
And is a great example of something very concrete that I just want to mention. I want to make sure I get my details correct. We met a young woman named Janell Hemming, who runs an organization called Nourish and Bloom, which are container-based and in some cases freezer-based healthy food stores that she is planting in food deserts across the country. Right.
Amazing.
It was amazing. We were fundamentally amazed as she was telling us this. And I guess I wonder then, that was a very long preamble, I apologize, but I wondered if you could speak a little about what it is that Janell embodies, and that perhaps what is it that the lesson perhaps that needs to be gleaned from the work that she's doing, because it is fundamentally amazing.
Absolutely. So Janell, and where are you, Janell? Hey! That's it.
Who among us has not heard a story about a city with a food desert inside? It just seems like an intractable problem.
Absolutely. So what Janell, I mean, there's many things, but one of the things, some of the things she embodies. So at New Profit, in a minute, I'll talk a little bit about New Profit and what we do. But one of the things we advance at New Profit is getting unrestricted capital to folks we call proximate leaders. And we use the word proximity in the same way that Brian Stevenson uses the word proximity. His thesis, which I also believe in, is that the way that the United States has such a just devastating rate of mass incarceration is because we behave as if the fates of some of us doesn't impact the fate of us all, and as if some of us are expendable for a thriving society. So he says that the solution in the mass incarceration space is proximity. And I believe that proximity is exactly what will enable us to identify the most powerful solutions. And there's the example. So we've heard about the food apartheid all over the country, right? And people sort of wring their hands and wipe their brows about, my God, how could we possibly? There's a supply shortage. There's issues with access to real estate, what property could, and everyone comes up with all the obstacles. But what proximate leaders like you are able to do is quickly and rapidly identify the existing assets in a community. So because they're operating with expertise, knowledge, and credibility in the communities that they serve, they're able to diagnose not only the needs, but the assets and resources. And they're innovative in ways that are uncommon, right? That is a model that from any standard of investing, it is economically sound, it is efficient, it is scalable, it is innovative, it is inclusive, and it advances equity and health and well-being. And we know from the data that health and access to healthy food impacts everything from educational outcomes to economic mobility to public health. We know that. So proximate leaders are folks who have not just a shared identity or skin tone with the community. Representation is not destiny. Proximate leaders are people who have meaningful knowledge of and credibility within the communities and constituencies that they want to serve. Most importantly, though, proximity is a practice. And what that means for us at New Profit is, it means that we're looking to support proximate leaders who have a track record of being guided by feedback and input from their communities and constituents. So, if you're melanated and serving Black communities, okay, that's cute. But what's the evidence that you have actually listened to what your target customers or your community has said about their needs, their aspirations, their resources, the impact of your services? Do you have models that allow you to shift your practice based on feedback and input from your constituents? Or do you have work plans and timelines that mean that any feedback that isn't praised is a problem, right? So I think that there's so much about what's embodied with your leadership. And, for folks who are in the room looking for I can't find all those stories about scarcity when it comes to, racially and ethnically diverse leadership and entrepreneurship. It's a myth. These resources and these ideas are abundant. That's one example in the room, but you really do embody what we talk about as proximate leadership, not just because of your identity, but because of the ways that you are guided by the aspirations, needs, and resources of the communities that you're serving.
It might be because of what I do, but sometimes when I hear a story about someone doing actual good effectively, it is extremely exciting to me. So I was extremely excited.
Absolutely.
Yes.
We need those stories. It is important. And if I get another chance at this life, who knows, right? They say the person who's going to live to be 150 years old has been born. So people are going to be, with grace and luck. Many of us will be living longer. But I'm a neuroscience geek is the other part of my story I didn't tell you. And so I talked about mental models because the importance of the fact that you stood up and took in the celebration, right? And allowed that to impact your parasympathetic nervous system, right? And allowed it to help you build a different neural pathway about what it means for you to come into spaces like this as a source of agency, talent, innovation, leadership, and solution. That's important. It's important for you to do that. It's important for all of us to stand and applaud you without coveting your recognition. There's a whole set of things that are important in terms of us as human beings building new neural pathways, right? And when you're building a new neural pathway, a new mental model, you actually have to be repetitive and vigilant. So every time you go somewhere, shout yourself out. And every time you hear about someone like this incredible leader here, shout them out. Because you need to reinforce a new neural pathway of abundance and generative creativity and connection, as opposed to scarcity and competition, which is based on a mental model that is a lie and that won't actually work for the society that is coming in a few minutes. Right.
That is sort of a natural follow. I would say, I want to ask, and I asked this question, I'm going to phrase it as, how do you do that work? How have you sort of taught and fostered in yourself, in your organization, the capacity to spot new and sound ideas, new and different leadership in different packages? How have you fostered the ability to advance Black women into leadership roles?
Sure.
And what I'm really asking is, how can we do that? What are things what are, say, 3 to 4 things that each of us could be doing differently?
Absolutely. Okay, so at New Profit is a venture philanthropy. We've been in existence for 25 years. We have, to date, invested just shy of $400 million unrestricted capital to support social impact leaders. And I would say about 2017, my colleague Eliza Greenberg is here. Where's Eliza? There she is. Hey, Eliza. Hey. So it was about 2017, I think, when we started to look at, we've made investments and done work we're incredibly proud of. We were one of the early investors in Teach for America, in Europe, in Youth Build, and many other organizations. What happened is that about 2016, 2017, the conversations that were sort of happening on the sidelines at our events, we brought them into the center of our organization. So basically, we would do events, and folks who looked like a lot of the folks in this room would say, it's a mystery to me how I get access to your capital, right? It's not clear how can I be down? I don't understand. I'm doing great work. How do I get on your radar and in your community and in your ecosystem? And so we recognized that if New Profit wanted to continue to be on the leading edge of supporting the nation's most powerful innovators and problem solvers, we had better get out of our own way and find ways to meaningfully build credibility and relationships and visibility into a broad range of communities of leaders, right? That we had, like many of us, we had fallen into a bit of a pattern of doing really good work, right? We were never causing harm, but our portfolio was at one point becoming homogenous racially and in terms of educational background. So we had a few folks of color. They mostly went to Harvard, Yale, right? So, again, representation isn't destiny. So what we did in 2017 is we said, we feel this, we see it, we observe it. Let's first get some data. So we did some research commissioned by the Gates Foundation, and found that at the time of our study, 30% of the population, things are changing fast, because in 2017, 2018, it was 30% of the population that identified as Black or Latinx. Those are the two groups we focused on initially. We've since expanded. And 30% of the population identified in that way. About 10% of nonprofit or social impact organizations were led by people who identified as Black or Latinx, but only at the time, 4% of philanthropic capital was going to organizations led by these BIPOC leaders, 4%. But then if you looked more closely, it wasn't just an issue of limited volume, it was that the number of restrictions on that 4% were notable. The number of touch points required for Black and brown people to get the grant, the term of the grant funding, always shorter. The duration of the opportunity cost. So you get the money, but we need for you to come to 4 convenings a year, right, in order to be eligible for the dollars. So incredibly high, exorbitant opportunity costs. I see heads nodding. So we said, okay, at New Profit, we have to change this. And I'll tell you specifically, because I am going to get to your question. One, we had to learn how to invest in excellence that was unfamiliar. What does that mean? It means that we couldn't only look for the charismatic, Ivy-educated, often male, entrepreneur and say that's the ticket. We had to be able to recognize impact and excellence that was done differently than the way we would do it. And that's one of the biggest things that you can do in this room if you're an investor or a philanthropist, or if you're an entrepreneur seeking funding. You can be clear about the excellence and impact you're achieving and not apologetic for the fact that your methodology may be less than familiar to your potential investor. Because we need to learn how to rapidly accelerate our ability to recognize and invest in a range of models that get to impact and results. We can't afford to keep having such a narrow set of approaches that we can support. So that's one thing. The other thing is we had to build in at New Profit timelines and work streams that built in space to pause and get feedback. That sounds really simple and maybe soft, but part of what happens when we care about social impact, it's moving so quickly that we think efficiency is a measure of quality, right? And I'm a fan of efficiency. But if something is simply fast, that doesn't mean it's good, right? And so we had to build in mechanisms to hear from parents, other students, if it was an educational initiative, employers, those who were unemployed and looking for employment opportunities, if it was an economic mobility initiative. We built in mechanisms for constituents and beneficiaries to tell us what they wanted, what they valued, how they had been hurt, in some cases by us. We had some real messy and muddy conversations where we said, listen, tell us the truth. There will be no consequence. And people told us the truth about well-intended actions we had taken that created distance and confusion about how to access resource. And we changed the whole game, but we had to be willing to listen and not internalize or punish. And for people who hold capital, that's hard to do, because if you're thinking about it as a charity and you want it to feel good, you may say, well, I'm not doing this, forget you. There's a whole long line of people who are happy to be here. But if you're thinking about impact, then you know we've got to work through some things together in order to create a different outcome.